Chapter 13 of The Chimney Corner by Harriet Beecher Stowe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 13 The Noble Army of Martyrs. When the first number of The Chimney Corner appeared, the snow lay white on the ground. The buds on the trees were closed and frozen, and beneath the hard frost-bound soil lay buried the last year's flower roots, waiting for a resurrection. So in our hearts it was winter, a winter of patient suffering and expectancy, a winter of suppressed sobs, of inward bleedings, a cold-choked, compressed anguish of endurance. For how long and how much, God could only tell us. The first paper of The Chimney Corner, as was most meet and fitting, was given to those homes made sacred and venerable by the cross of martyrdom, by the chrism of a great sorrow. That chimney corner made bright by home firelight seemed a fitting place for a solemn act of reverent sympathy for the homes by whose darkness our homes had been preserved bright, by whose emptiness our homes had been kept full, by whose losses our homes had been enriched. And so we ventured with trembling to utter these words of sympathy and cheer to those whom God had chosen to this great sacrifice of sorrow. The winter months passed with silent footsteps. Spring returned, and the sun, with ever-waxing power, unsealed the snowy sepulchre of buds and leaves. Birds reappeared, brooks were unchained, flowers filled every desolate dell with blossoms and perfume. And with returning spring, in like manner, the chill frost of our fears and of our dangers melted before the breath of the Lord. The great war, which lay like a mountain of ice upon our hearts, suddenly dissolved and was gone. The fears of the past were as a dream when one awaketh, and now we scarce realize our deliverance. 1,000 hopes are springing up everywhere like spring flowers in the forest. All is hopefulness, all is bewildering joy. But this our joy has been ordained to be changed into a wail of sorrow. The kind hard hand that held the helm so steadily in the desperate tossings of the storm has been stricken down just as we entered port. The fatherly heart that bore all our sorrows can take no earthly part in our joys. His were the cares, the watchings, the toils, the agonies of a nation in mortal struggle. And God, looking down, was so well pleased with his humble faithfulness, his patient continuance in well-doing, that earthly rewards and honors all seemed too poor for him. So he reached down and took him to immortal glories. Well done, good and faithful servant. Enter thou into the joy of the Lord. Henceforth the place of Abraham Lincoln is first among the noble army of martyrs who have given their blood to the cause of human freedom. The eyes are yet too dim with tears that would seek calmly to trace out his place in history. He has been a marvel and a phenomenon among statesmen, a new kind of ruler in the earth. There has been something even unearthly about his extreme unselfishness, his utter want of personal ambition, personal self-valuation, personal feeling. The most unsparing criticism, denunciation, and ridicule never moved him to a single bitter expression, never seemed to awaken in him a single bitter thought. The most exultant hour of party victory brought no exultation to him. He accepted power not as an honor, but as a responsibility. And when, after a severe struggle, that power came a second time into his hands, there was something preternatural in the calmness of his acceptance of it. The first impulse seemed to be a disclaimer of all triumph over the party that had strained their utmost to push him from his seat, and then a sober girding up of his loins to go on with the work to which he was appointed. His last inaugural was characterized by a tone so peculiarly solemn and free from earthly passion that it seems to us now, who look back on it in the light of what has followed, as if his soul had already parted from earthly things and felt the powers of the world to come. It was not the formal state paper of the chief of a party in an hour of victory, so much as the soliloquy of a great soul reviewing its course under a vast responsibility, and appealing from all earthly judgments to the tribunal of infinite justice. It was the solemn clearing of his soul for the great sacrament of death, and the words that he quoted in it with such thrilling power were those of the adoring spirits that veiled their faces before the throne. Just and true are thy ways, thou King of saints. Among the rich treasures which this bitter struggle has brought to our country, not the least is the moral wealth which has come to us in the memory of our martyrs. Thousands of men, women, and children, too, in this great conflict, have endured tortures, not accepting deliverance, counting not their lives dear unto them in the holy cause, and they have done this as understandingly and thoughtfully as the first Christians who sealed their witness with their blood. Let us, in our hour of deliverance and victory, record the solemn vow that our right hand shall forget her cunning before we forget them and their sufferings, that our tongue shall cleave to the roof of our mouth if we remember them not above our chief joy. Least suffering among that noble band were those who laid down their lives on the battlefield, to whom was given a brief and speedy passage to the victor's meed. The mourners who mourn for such as these must give place to another and more august band, who have sounded lower deeps of anguish, and drained bitterer drops out of our great cup of trembling. The narrative of the lingering tortures, indignities, and sufferings of our soldiers in rebel prisons has been something so harrowing that we have not dared to dwell upon it. We have been helplessly dumb before it, and have turned away our eyes from what we could not relieve, and therefore could not endure to look upon. And now, when the nation is called to strike the great and solemn balance of justice, and to decide measures of final retribution, it behooves us all that we should at least watch with our brethren for 1 hour, and take into our account what they have been made to suffer for us. Sterne said that he could realize the miseries of captivities only by setting before him the image of a miserable captive with hollow cheek and wasted eye, notching upon a stick, day after day, the weary record of the flight of time. So we can form a more vivid picture of the sufferings of our martyrs from one simple story than from any general description, and therefore we will speak right on and tell one story which might stand as a specimen of what has been done and suffered by thousands. In the town of Andover, Massachusetts, a boy of 16, named Walter Raymond, enlisted among our volunteers. He was under the prescribed age, but his eager zeal led him to follow the footsteps of an elder brother who had already enlisted, and the father of the boy, though these two were all the sons he had, instead of availing himself of his legal right to withdraw him, endorsed the act in the following letter addressed to his captain. Andover, Massachusetts, August 15, 1862. Captain Hunt, my eldest son has enlisted in your company. I send you his younger brother. He is and always has been in perfect health, a more than ordinary power of endurance, honest, truthful, and courageous. I doubt not you will find him on trial all you can ask, except his age, and that I am sorry to say is only 16. Yet if our country needs his services, take him. Your obedient servant, Samuel Raymond. The boy went forth to real service and to successive battles at Kingston, at Whitehall, and at Goldsboro, and in all did his duty bravely and faithfully. He met the temptations and dangers of a soldier's life with the pure-hearted firmness of a Christian child, neither afraid nor ashamed to remember his baptismal vows, his Sunday school teachings, and his mother's wishes. He had passed his promise to his mother against drinking and smoking, and held it with a simple childlike steadiness. When in the midst of malarious swamps, physicians and officers advised the use of tobacco, the boy writes to his mother, "A great many have begun to smoke, but I shall not do it without your permission, though I think it does a great deal of good." In his leisure hours he was found in his tent reading, and before battle he prepared his soul with the beautiful psalms and collects of the day, as appointed by his church, and writes with simplicity to his friends, "I prayed God that he would watch over me, and if I fell, receive my soul in heaven. And I also pray that I might not forget the cause I was fighting for, and not turn my back in fear." After a 9-month service he returned with a soldier's experience, though with a frame weakened by sickness in a malarious region. But no sooner did health and strength return than he again enlisted, in the Massachusetts cavalry service, and passed many months of constant activity and adventure, being in some severe skirmishes and battles with that portion of Sheridan's troops who approached nearest to Richmond, getting within 1.5 miles of the city. At the close of this raid, so hard had been the service, that only 30 horses were left out of 74 in his company, and Walter and 2 others were the sole survivors among 8 who occupied the same tent. On the 16th of August, Walter was taken prisoner in a skirmish, and from that time that this news reached his parents till the 18th of the following March, they could ascertain nothing of his fate. A general exchange of prisoners having been then effected, they learned that he died on Christmas Day in Salisbury prison, of hardship and privation. What these hardships were is, alas, easy to be known from those too well authenticated accounts published by our government of the treatment experienced by our soldiers in the rebel prisons. Robbed of clothing, of money, of the soldier's best friend, his sheltering blanket, herded in shivering nakedness on the bare ground, deprived of every implement by which men of energy and spirit had soon bettered their lot, forbidden to cut in adjacent forests branches for shelter or fuel to cook their coarse food, fed on a pint of corn and cob meal per day, with some slight addition of molasses or rancid meat, denied all mental resources, all letters from home, all writing to friends. These men were cut off from the land of the living while yet they lived. They were made to dwell in darkness as those that have been long dead. By such slow, lingering tortures, such weary, wasting anguish and sickness of body and soul, it was the infernal policy of the rebel government either to wring from them an abjuration of their country, or by slow and steady draining away of the vital forces to render them unfit to serve in her armies. Walter's constitution bore 4 months of this usage, when death came to his release. A fellow sufferer, who was with him in his last hours, brought the account to his parents. Through all his terrible privations, even the lingering pains of slow starvation, Walter preserved his steady simplicity, his faith in God, and unswerving fidelity to the cause for which he was suffering. When the rebels had kept the prisoners fasting for days, and then brought in delicacies to tempt their appetite, hoping thereby to induce them to desert their flag, he only answered, "I would rather be carried out in that dead cart." When told by some that he must steal from his fellow sufferers, as many did, in order to relieve the pangs of hunger, he answered, "No, I was not brought up to that." And so, when his weakened system would no longer receive the cob meal, which was his principal allowance, he set his face calmly toward death. He grew gradually weaker and weaker, and fainter, and at last disease of the lungs set in, and it became apparent that the end was at hand. On Christmas Day, while thousands among us were bowing in our garlanded churches, or surrounding festive tables, this young martyr lay on the cold, damp ground, watched over by his destitute friends, who sought to soothe his last hours with such scanty comforts as their utter poverty afforded. Raising his head on the block of wood which was his only pillow, and moistening his brow and lips with water, while his life ebbed slowly away, till about 2 o'clock, when he suddenly roused himself, stretched out his hand, and, drawing to him his dearest friend among those around him, said in a strong, clear voice, "I am going to die. Go tell my father I am ready to die, for I die for God and my country." And looking up with a triumphant smile, he passed on to the reward of the faithful. And now, men and brethren, if this story were a single one, it were worthy to be had in remembrance. But Walter Raymond is not the only noble-hearted boy or man that has been slowly tortured and starved and done to death by the fiendish policy of Jefferson Davis and Robert Edmond Lee. No, wherever this simple history shall be read, there will arise hundreds of men and women who will testify, "Just so died my son, so died my brother, so died my husband, so died my father." The numbers who have died in these lingering tortures are to be counted not by hundreds or even by thousands, but by tens of thousands. And is there to be no retribution for a cruelty so vast, so aggravated, so cowardly and base? And if there is retribution, on whose head should it fall? Shall we seize and hang the poor, ignorant, stupid, imbruted semi-barbarians who were set as jailers to keep these hells of torment and inflict these insults and cruelties? Or shall we punish the educated, intelligent chiefs who are the head and brain of the iniquity? If General Lee had been determined not to have prisoners starved or abused, does anyone doubt that he could have prevented these things? Nobody doubts it. His raiment is red with the blood of his helpless captives. Does anyone doubt that Jefferson Davis, living in ease and luxury in Richmond, knew that men were dying by inches in filth and squalor, in privation in the Libby prison, within bowshot of his own door? Nobody doubts it. It was his will, his deliberate policy, thus to destroy those who fell into his hands. The chief of a so-called confederacy, who could calmly consider among his official documents incendiary plots for the secret destruction of ships, hotels, and cities full of peaceable people, is a chief well worthy to preside over such cruelties. But his only just title is President of Assassins, and the whole civilized world should make common cause against such a miscreant. There has been on both sides of the water much weak, ill-advised talk of mercy and magnanimity to be extended to these men, whose crimes have produced a misery so vast and incalculable. The wretches who have tortured the weak and the helpless, who have secretly plotted to supplement, by dastardly schemes of murder and arson, that strength which failed them in fair fight, have been commiserated as brave generals and unfortunate patriots, and efforts are made to place them within the committees of war. It is no feeling of personal vengeance, but a sense of the eternal fitness of things that makes us rejoice when criminals who have so outraged every sentiment of humanity are arrested and arraigned and awarded due retribution at the bar of their country's justice. There are crimes against God and human nature which it is treason alike to God and man not to punish, and such have been the crimes of the traitors who were banded together in Richmond. If there be those whose hearts lean to pity, we can show them where all the pity of their hearts may be better bestowed than in deploring the woes of assassins. Let them think of the thousands of fathers, mothers, wives, sisters, whose lives will be forever haunted with memories of the slow tortures in which their best and bravest were done to death. The sufferings of those brave men are ended. Nearly 100,000 are sleeping in those sad, nameless graves, and may the rest be sweet. There the wicked cease from troubling. There the weary are at rest. There the prisoners rest together. They hear not the voice of the oppressor. But, O ye who have pity to spare, spare it for the broken-hearted friends, who to life's end will suffer over and over all that their dear ones endured. Pity the mothers who hear their sons' faint calls in dreams, who in many a weary night watch see them pining and wasting, and yearn with a lifelong, unappeasable yearning to have been able to soothe those forsaken, lonely deathbeds. O man or woman, if you have pity to spare, spend it not on Lee or Davis. Spend it on their victims, or the thousands of living hearts which these men of sin have doomed to an anguish that will end only with life. Blessed are the mothers whose sons passed in battle, a quick, a painless, a glorious death. Blessed in comparison, yet we weep for them. We rise up and give place at sight of their mourning garments. We reverence the sanctity of their sorrow. But before this other sorrow we are dumb in awful silence. We find no words with which to console such grief. We feel that our peace, our liberties, have been bought at a fearful price when we think of the sufferings of our martyred soldiers. Let us think of them. It was for us they bore hunger and cold and nakedness. They might have had food and raiment and comforts if they would have deserted our cause, and they did not. Cut off from all communication with home or friends or brethren, dragging on the weary months, apparently forgotten, still they would not yield. They would not fight against us, and so for us at last they died. What return can we make them? Peace has come, and we take up all our blessings restored and brightened. But if we look, we shall see on every blessing a bloody cross. when 3 brave men broke through the ranks of the enemy to bring to King David a draught from the home well for which he longed, the generous-hearted prince would not drink it, but poured it out as an offering before the Lord. For he said, "Is not this the blood of the men that went in jeopardy of their lives? Thousands of noble hearts have been slowly consumed to secure to us the blessings we are rejoicing in. We owe a duty to these martyrs, the only one we can pay. In every place honored by such a history and example, let a monument be raised at the public expense, on which shall be inscribed the names of those who died for their country, and the manner of their death. Such monuments will educate our young men in heroic virtue, and keep alive to future ages the flame of patriotism. And thus, too, to the aching heart of bereaved, love shall be given the only consolation of which its sorrows admit, in the reverence which is paid to its lost loved ones." The End. End of Chapter 13, The Noble Army of Martyrs, and end of The Chimney Corner by Harriet Beecher Stowe.